This is kind of like a bonus video after video 4 bond section. If you watch the other 4 videos, you don't really need to go into this 101 the basics. But if you kind of want to go a little more in depth and kind of connect bond inflation, this is going to be a quick video about this. And then we kind of briefly talk about economics, sense of nominal yield, GDP only because I explained it, you'll see what I'm talking about. So if you kind of want to learn about inflation and bonds, to watch this bonus video. Very, very simple, very, very short. I'm going to keep it short. I'm going to get started right now. Okay, so how inflation affects bonds. Let's start with the basics. Inflation and bonds don't get along very well. Okay? Bonds pay you a fixed amount of interest, which is known as a coupon. And when inflation rises, that fixed payment loses power. So let's say, for example, if you buy a bond, a 50-year bond, sorry, a $50, sorry, if you buy, let's say you buy, you pay $50 a year and inflation goes up 5%. That $50 buys less. And so what happens is your real return shrinks. But bonds, especially long-term ones, often drop in value when inflation is rising. So the market starts demanding higher yields to keep up with the rising prices. So existing bonds with lower fixed coupons become less attractive by comparison. If competitive, the price of those older bonds fall, which rises their effective yield to match the new market environment. So this phenomenon is as an inflation risk, and it's also one of the key reasons bond value defaults. The longer the bond maturity, the more sensitive it is. This is because your money is locked into a fixed payment for a longer time while the cost of living keeps rising. It's also important to understand that for bond investors to keep an eye not just on interest rates, but also on inflation expectations. They can directly impact the real value of the return. So in the last 4 videos, I kind of mentioned that interest rates kind of helps price the bond, but not only does interest, also inflation does, because interest rates might stay the same, and you may think, oh wow, the bond is worth the same. But if inflation goes up, well, bond value goes down. So the government kind of created something called TIPS, and they created this to protect against inflation. And so the US government created something called the Treasury Inflation Protected Securities. And the way it works is TIPS works a little differently from regular bonds. So with a traditional bond, your principal, which is the amount you invested, stays the same. You know this. Even if inflation goes up, your principal will stay the same. But with TIPS, the principal actually increases with inflation based on change in the Consumer Price Index, CPI, which is the government's official measure of inflation. There's 2 ways of measuring inflation. There's the CPI and there's another formula, which I will actually mention in this video. But we're not really talking about economics. So let's say you buy $1,000 worth of TIPS, and next year inflation rises by 3%. Instead of your principal staying 1,000, your principal actually will increase to 1,030. Now, it also may not seem like much, but it also means your interest payments increase too, because they're calculated as a percentage of the new higher principal. So if your TIPS pays 1% interest, instead of getting 1% of $1,000 from a year ago, you now get $1,000, 1% of $1,030. And if inflation continues, both your principals and interest payments will keep going, because principal goes up, and the interest will take its percent from. When the bond matures, you get back the inflation adjusted principal. So not just the original amount you put in. And so what this creates is it means your money keeps its real purchasing power even the price raises over time. So let's say I buy a bond, a 5-year bond, and first 2 years inflation is the same, and then inflation goes up 2%, and then my new principal is higher. So let's say $1,000 principal, inflation goes up by 2%. Now my principal is 1,020, and then let's say it goes up by another percent of that, so it'll be 20, so it goes even more. And the reason it keeps the same purchasing power is because when I get the principal back, if I only got to $1,000, that $1,000 buys me less now than it did 5 years ago, or whatever. This is present value and future value. I kind of mentioned this in another video. And so the reason it keeps the same purchasing power is because as inflation increases, so will my principal, the same amount, and that there is no difference in between that. Tips are great for conservative investors who care more about preserving value than chasing high returns. They're especially useful in retirement portfolios or during times when inflation is expected to be high. You do want to keep one thing in mind though. Tips usually offer a lower base interest rate than regular government bonds. And that is because they're already giving you that built-in like protection against inflation. And also, if inflation stays low or falls, tips won't really perform as well as traditional bonds. So basically, in short, you could kind of say tips are designed to protect your money from losing value due to inflation, but you won't really get rich off them because you won't fall behind. So real versus nominal yield. Before we talk about bond yields, let's take a simple like a weight look to understand the difference between nominal and real yields with GDP. So firstly, I don't know if you know this, GDP, you're gonna learn this in school. GDP is a gross domestic product, and it's the total value of all goods and services a country produces in a year. This looks at macroeconomics, not really micro. Micro is more of supply and demand stuff. So it's a key way to measure how an economy is doing. Now nominal GDP measures the value using current market prices. So whatever the market price is, that's the one we're going to use, and including the effect of inflation. So if prices go up, nominal GDP can look like it's growing, even if the economy is actually producing more. So let's say we are producing the exact same amount, right? So this form right here is consumption, investment, government expenditures, and then imports. Now this equation does break into more than just IGM. A lot more than that, but we're not. So let's say all of these numbers are the same, right? Consumption, we have 5,000 units, 5,000 units, 5,000, whatever, 5,000 units. But the market price right now, let's say, is $5. So this multiplied by $5, that's going to give us a consumption for the year. And when we add that up, that's going to give us GDP. However, the problem is we could have the exact same amount of consumption, investment, government expenditure, all that. Let's say market price increases by $2. So now market price is $7. Now when we multiply this, our GDP is higher. The problem is that we're not adjusting for inflation. We're just taking that inflated price, multiplying it, and saying that, oh, GDP increased by this much. The truth is, we had the exact same amount of units. We didn't increase our GDP technically. We technically did, but we didn't because we're producing the same amount. So like I said, if prices go up, nominal GDP can look like it's growing, even if the economy isn't actually producing more. As to where real GDP comes. What happens is real GDP, on the other hand, removes inflation from the equation. It shows how much the economy is growing in terms of actual output. What happens now is, in the first year, our deflator is going to be 1. Okay? And what happens now is we get this deflator that kind of divides our nominal GDP to give us the real value. So what would happen here is nominal GDP will be here, and with the deflator, it will tell us the real GDP. That's what's gonna kind of eliminate that inflation. It's gonna put inflation in the equation. I'm not gonna go into that. That's not the point of the slide. It's just a quick eco lesson. I'm probably gonna do an economic session. Well, I might start that series, but that's for next time. So real GDP, on the other hand, removes inflation from the equation, and it shows how much the economy is growing in terms of output, not just prices, like I mentioned. So now when comparing bonds, it's important to understand the difference between nominal yield and real yield. Same thing as GDP, the nominal yield is the interest printed on the bond. So let's say, I don't know, 5%. But if inflation is 3%, your real yield is actually closer to 2% because inflation eats into what the return is worth. Now, we're not going to use these fancy formulas, but if you're getting 5% interest rate, right? But then 3% of that is inflation. Well, mathematically, I'm not going to prove it, but you could just subtract that 5 minus 3 to get the real yield, the amount you're actually getting, which is a 2%. And investing, it's the real yield that determines how much your money is actually going in terms of buy. So always compare bond yields in the current inflation rate, not just other bonds. And even high nominal yield can lose you money if inflation is higher than your return. But why long-term bonds suffer in high inflation? That's a big question. Very quickly though, one of the biggest inflation risks lies within long-term bonds. If you lock in, let's say like a 10, 15, 30-year bond at a low rate, and inflation starts to rise, you're stuck with a bond that's paying way below what the market demands. And so as a result, the market value of your bond drops. And it could also be significant sometimes. It depends on the scenario. And so to match the new inflation adjusted reality. This is why long bonds are much more sensitive to inflation and interest rate changes. Short-term bonds are less risky in this scenario. They mature sooner and they can be reinvested at a higher rate more quickly. And so in an inflationary environment, when inflation is increasing, keeping bond duration shorter or using tips is often a smart. So very simple. You're buying in a 30-year bond, your long-term bond. If interest rates are increasing in the market, you are stuck with the interest rates that were in the market when you bought the bond. You're making less money from your bond later. This is why the bond value decreases. Same thing for inflation. Interest rates can be the same, but if inflation increased, you're still making less money than you would be about the bond that year with the bond. That's also going to bond value. So yeah, sure. That's why 30-year bonds and term bonds stuff, because you're making a commitment. And let's say you bought a 30-year bond, and all of a sudden, 1 year later, interest rates increase. You have a lower interest rate because you before. And for the next 29 years, you're going to receive less money than you would if you bought the bond 1 year. That's kind of why it's sensitive. And same thing for inflation, like I mentioned. That pretty much summarizes the video. It's a very, very quick video on inflation bonds. And maybe there's going to be more videos in the bond section. I doubt it. But I hope you learned a lot from these 5 videos if you watched this one as well. And I'll see you guys in a new series that is coming out soon.